So thanks a lot, Federico, and everybody for at the bank for inviting me. It's really great to present to you. Hopefully, in the near future, I can go in person as well. So I'm going to present this work that I'm doing with my colleague here at UCLA, David Bakai, which is titled "Welfare and Output with Income Effects and Taste Shocks." And please feel free to interrupt me with any comments or questions as we go along. So the paper, we're interested in a very kind of standard question in economics. It's one of the things as economists do all the time, which is to think about how does welfare respond to changes in choices. So for example, if you have one individual consumer and the budget constraint that individual faces changes, either because of changes in income or changes in prices or changes in taxes, for example, how does that affect her welfare? Or at the more macro level, if you think about a society and there's a change in the set of technologies in the production possibility frontier that the society faces, how does the change in these technologies affect welfare? Okay, so we're going to answer this question by relying on standard tools in micro theory, which is to state changes in welfare in terms of objects for which we understand the units. Okay, so that's why there are these measures like equivalent variation, compensating variation, which are expressed in money terms, for example. So the specific way, a standard way of measuring welfare when choices change is to think about how much. So suppose let's take T0 and T1, where T0 and T1 could be two time periods, and suppose that the choice sets of an individual changes, the budget constraint changes. So a standard way to measure welfare is to ask the question, how much income, or how much endowment or income in this case, has to change at the initial period T0 to make the consumer indifferent between the choice set this consumer has at T0 and at T1. Okay, so that's kind of a standard kind of money metric type measure. Okay, and it turns out that that if preferences have certain properties, in particular, preferences are stable over time. The preferences of the consumer are stable in the sense that the parameters of the utility function do not change over time, let's say. And if they're homothetic, that is, the income elasticities are equal to 1 for every good, then the answer to this question can be expressed in a very simple way, using a formula that is called like a chain index or a division index. So what's the answer to this question? So again, like consider two time periods, T0 and T1. And we want to answer this question comparing the budget constraint in one period versus the other, how much income you have to give a consumer for her to be indifferent in the two budget constraints. And the answer to this question can be answered in this way, which is take the log of spending, of nominal spending, nominal income, let's say, at T1 over T0, so that's the change in the nominal income, minus a change in a price deflator, a price index, okay? And so what is this price deflator that you use to deflate changes in nominal spending? Well, the way to construct it is to go from T0 to T1 and compute a weighted average of changes in prices for each good I, for each small period of time, and where this weighted average is constructed using budget shares at every point in time. So if we want to compare a budget constraint between 1960 and 2000, let's say, so we're gonna start in the year 1960. We're gonna take the changes in prices between 1960 and 1961, and we're gonna weight them by the budget share of each good in 1960. Then we're gonna move from 61 to 62. A weighted average of the price changes weighted by the spending shares of each good in 1961. So we update the key is that we're updating the shares, and that kind of accounts for substitution over time. Okay, and one can show that this formula, I mean, in the case of when you make the time periods very short, that's why I'm writing these things with an interval, exactly answers this question if preferences satisfy these two properties, stability and homotheticity. And this formula, this is called a chain weighted index, because you're updating the weights over time, or in continuous time it's called division index. This is like the foundation for how we measure, how we aggregate data in macroeconomics mostly. So if you look at how we measure inflation, the weights are updated regularly, or depending on the setting, or the personal consumption deflator, that the shares are updated very regularly. If you measure real GDP, you use a deflator that is like that, or if you measure TFP at the aggregate level or at the sectorial level, this kind of measure is used. Okay, so this is really like the foundation for how we aggregate data in both for quantities and prices. Okay? And it's used like ubiquitously in many contexts in economics. Okay? Now, so the question so what I said is that this formula can be derived and answer this question under these very strict conditions on preferences, stability and homotheticity. So there's no demand shocks and preferences are homothetic. These are very convenient properties that we use a lot, but they're kind of counterfactual. If you think about, there's a lot of evidence that certain goods have a higher income elasticity than others. Think about luxury goods, or as societies grow, they spend different shares on different goods and at the individual level too. So that's a violation of homotheticity. And there's a lot of settings where the demand for different goods changes over time without changes in prices or income. Okay, so that's like, we think of that as like a taste or a demand shock. Okay, so so the question we want to ask in this paper is what to do, how to measure welfare, and what's the link between welfare measures and these chain-weighted measures, the way that they're constructed in the data, when these two properties of preferences are violated. Okay, so so what are we going to do? We're going to characterize both changes in welfare and chain objects, the way that they're constructed in the data, both in partial equilibrium and in general equilibrium. And I'm going to be clear what I mean by this distinction between partial and general equilibrium, in terms of sufficient statistics. Okay, things that can potentially be measured in the data. Okay, and kind of to give you a preview of what the main issue is going to be when you move away from the world of stable and homothetic preferences, is that basically the chain indices, the way that we construct inflation in the data, or TFP in the data, the deflators, if you look at this formula, they basically use the observed changes in the observed shares of each good at each point in time, without distinguishing what's driving these shares. Okay, if it's changes in prices or demand shocks or income effects. Okay. However, welfare does not do that. So our welfare measures are not going to treat all changes in budget shares in the same way. So certain things are going to, we want to use the budget shares that reflect certain things but not others, and I'm going to be clear about that. Okay, and that's going to give rise to a gap between measured objects and welfare relevant objects, and we're going to show, like, we're going to characterize what determines this gap. Okay, and then this partial general equilibrium distinction. So these are going to be two different welfare questions one can ask, one in partial equilibrium, one in general equilibrium. In a world with stable and homothetic preferences, this distinction doesn't matter, but it will matter when we move away from those assumptions, and I'm going to make that clear. Okay. So and then like in the second part of the paper, we're going to use these results, these theoretical results, for 3 applications. Okay, and the applications are going to be about long run growth and more like business cycle fluctuations. So the first application is going to be on about long-term growth. We're going to talk about the Baumol's causes. We're going to think about like what's the welfare relevant Baumol's causes. I'm going to explain what this is in a few minutes. The second application is going to be about potential biases between measured objects, measured inflation, measured productivity, and welfare relevant objects in the presence of firm level shocks. Okay, and the third application is going to be more on the recent COVID-19 recession. If you think about COVID, that's like we think it's like a clear example where, I mean, we know there were huge changes in the budget shares between say restaurants and supermarket bought food. Okay, and we don't think that that's coming from changes in prices or changes in income. That's like people value differently eating out in a restaurant or eating at home during COVID. Okay, so there's a question like, how do we measure inflation when you have these dramatic changes in budget shares that are not driven by changes in relative prices? Okay, so we're going to think about that, and we're going to use this a COVID example to illustrate the difference between partial equilibrium and general equilibrium measures of welfare. And we're going to illustrate something else, which is a path dependence of these indices when there's income effects or demand shocks. So these 3 applications, I think, are going to try to make clear why it is important to characterize this gap between welfare and chain weighted objects as measured in the data. So basically, very quick mention to the literature. Of course, there's a huge literature trying to understand what could be like gaps between stuff as we measure in the data and welfare relevant objects. So most of the previous work on this question basically is about the fact that as we don't measure all the relevant prices. For example, there's some goods like leisure that we don't measure, or maybe there's some quality mismeasurement in the way we measure prices, etc. So that's all about gaps between measured and chain objects welfare relevant and chain objects due to mismeasurement in prices. Instead, we're going to focus on violations of these 2 key assumptions and preferences that are required to derive these indices, both stability and homotheticity. And we're going to assume that the data, at least in the theoretical results, the data is going to be perfect. Like we're going to measure prices perfectly, all right, for all goods. So we're just to focus on what we think is more novel in terms of this question. Okay, so that's the introduction. I'm going to start from the micro problem, the partial equilibrium question. Then I'm going to go to the general equilibrium question, and then I'm going to talk about applications. And if I have time, I'm going to talk about some extensions. So, yeah.
Ernesto here, very, very quickly, just to fix ideas. Are you going to be able to talk about heterogeneity in preferences?
That's one of our extensions. We have heterogeneous agents. For the presentation, I'm gonna focus on. I mean, so the microeconomic problem is going to be one individual. So there's no issue. For the macro problem, I'm gonna write the model with homogeneous representative agents, but in one of the extensions deals with that, and our results can be generalized to allow for heterogeneous agents.
But more than a generalization, can we extrapolate the type of issues that you're going to talk to us coming from time varying preferences or state dependent preferences, if you wish? to an environment where suppose that there is not such a time varying preferences, but there is heterogeneity in the preferences. So still the standard aggregation stuff don't work, still for the same reason, still the same problems arise?
Yeah, so there's going to be some extra terms in the way we measure aggregate welfare. I mean, we're going to consider one particular measure of welfare with heterogeneous agents. I'm going to talk about that as an extension. And in the case where you have a homogeneous agents, that formula will collapse to the one I'm going to talk about now. So we can talk about that after setting up the basic problem, but yeah, there are already, we can handle that heterogeneity too. Of course, there's additional terms, but we show how to compute aggregate welfare when you have heterogeneous agents. Okay, so let me start then with a micro problem. It's going to be much simpler than the genetic equilibrium problem. I think it's useful kind of to fix some ideas. And so here's the setting. So we're gonna consider one person. This is a micro problem, one person at a time, with a preference relation over vectors of consumption goods, C. So C is a vector across many goods, quantities of many goods, and this preferences basically order these different vectors of consumption goods. Okay? Standard micro. Now we're going to include an index X, which so we allow for preferences to vary with X. So what can X stand for? Could be age. As you age, you like coffee more than milk, let's say. Could be driven by fads or advertising, that you see some advertising and then you change how you rank different goods. Could be the state of nature. You break an arm and you value goods differently, or you live in a world with COVID and you value differently, you rank differently eating out or eating at home. Okay, so those are examples of X. It's basically anything that shifts how you rank different vectors of goods. Okay, the kind of two important things about X is that, number one, agents, in contrast to C, to consumption goods, agents are not going to choose X. Okay, so they're not going to choose if they live in a world with COVID or not, or they're not going to choose if they're old or young, or if they broke their arm or not. Okay, so and hence we're not going to model preferences over X. It could be that people have preferences over having a broken arm or not, but we're not going to. They don't choose that. So we're not going to model this preference over X. Okay, and we're going to so as a standard, we're going to represent each of these preferences. We're going to represent them by a utility function. Okay, which is now indexed by this X. Okay, and the indirect utility associated to this utility function is V, which depends on the vector of prices for each good, income, and always indexed by this X. Okay, notice that it kind of, given that I don't have preferences over X, it's not meaningful to compare UC of X for one X versus the other. Okay, so this is just depends on how you cardinalize the utility function. Okay, what's going to be more relevant is, like, for given preferences, how you value or how you rank different vectors of goods. Okay. Okay, so now kind of what I'm going to do. So consider 2 points, T0, T1, could be time, 2 time periods, could be two points in space, could be sequences also, but for simplicity, I'm going to focus more on time, T0 and T1 being time, but the same results will apply for space also, comparing how a person feels between prices and income in 2 points in space. So we're gonna think of changing the budget constraint that the consumer faces, where prices go from PT0 to PT1. PT is a vector, and income goes from IT0 to IT1. So we're gonna consider how welfare changes. Then we're gonna consider how chain real consumption changes as a statistician would construct it, and then we're gonna compare the difference. So this is kind of a definition. The change in real consumption, delta log y, between T0 and T1, is going to be, as I defined it before, the change in nominal income deflated by a weighted average of price changes as I move from T0 to T1. Okay, where again I'm adjusting the shares at every point in time between T0 and T1. Okay, so what's welfare? And this is kind of formally the definition that I used in the first slide. So basically, the welfare measure in terms of units that we understand. So it's going to be in terms of money. So we're gonna ask a question: how much income is needed under the initial prices, okay, to make a consumer with some fixed preferences? I'm going to use final preferences. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Indifferent to the new budget constraint at T1. So mathematically, this is like in percentage terms, how much income has to be increased at T0 so that this person is indifferent between what she can get at T0 and what she can get at T1. Okay, so that's like, so EVM is if this person is better off at T1 than at T0, then EVM is positive. If this person is worse, then EVM is negative. Okay, so this is a standard measure of equivalent variation. Why do we use equivalent variation and not compensating variation? We have both sets of results in the paper. We think EV is it's more interesting because it's a money metric representation of utility. Basically, EV contains all the information that the utility function has. I can compare two budget constraints from the point of view with T0 prices, and if EV is higher for one than the other, then the utility is higher for the allocations of one versus the other. So in that sense, EV is more useful because it contains the same information as the preferences. CV does not. And the other thing that is important here is that notice that I'm keeping XT1, the preference is constant in the comparison. Okay, so I'm not asking the question like, how much money do you have to give to Ernesto when he was 10 to be as well off as he is now when he's like older? Okay, that question is we cannot answer the question. So there I would like be comparing Ernesto's preferences when he was 10 versus Ernesto's preferences at his current age. There's nothing in the data that allows me to answer that question, at least choice data. So I mean, because Ernesto is not choosing his age. So the only thing I can say is, given some preferences, let's say I'm going to fix Ernesto's preferences today, how Ernesto values the budget constraint he faced when he was 10 versus the budget constraint he faces now. Okay, no. So why am I picking T1 preferences as opposed to T0? For temporal comparisons, which is like mostly what we do in this paper, I think that's more relevant. For most practical questions, you want to ask questions like how using current preferences. Okay, for spatial comparisons, if I want to compare Ernesto's welfare under prices and income in Chile versus those in Argentina, then both are interesting and relevant. But for temporal preferences, for temporal comparisons, we think T1 is more relevant. And the final point I want to make is that a lot of times changes in tastes are treated in the same way as changes in quality. And for some questions, like if you write a CS preferences where there's like shifts in the quality of each good and the demand for each good in the taste component, for some questions those two things are equivalent, but for welfare they're very different. Because again, you don't pick your tastes, whereas you can choose between buying a high quality or a low quality computer. So you can ask welfare questions where you change the quality of the goods, but it's very different for taste, where it's not meaningful to that. Okay, so that's the definition, the formal definition of how we're going to measure welfare, our baseline measure. We do also CV and T0 preferences in the paper, but I want to be more, I want to make it more concrete, and I'm going to focus on this measure. Okay, so now I'm going to compare like EV versus welfare versus real consumption as constructed in the data. Okay, so for that, let me define the budget shares on every good given prices, given utility, and given preferences of the consumer. So these are like Hicksian budget shares as a function of U instead of as a function of income. So I can rewrite the change in real consumption in the same way as before, but now instead of writing this ratio here, I'm going to write it with the budget shares, with this piece for each good. Okay. And the key is that for real consumption, I'm using the observed or the actual budget shares at every point in time as I move from T0 to T1. So you can see PT, UT, XT are all indexed by T. And that's how the weights are used to construct this average of price changes. So it's like I'm using an inflation measure where every point in time I use the observed budget shares of each good in between these two time periods. Okay. Now look at this is what welfare is. Okay, it's very similar, but instead of using, so it's going to use budget shares at current prices in the same way as real consumption, but it's going to fix U at T1, and it's going to fix preferences at T1. Okay, so you can see right away that if preferences are stable, then the budget shares don't depend on X, right? That's what it means, that there's no demand shocks. Like the budget shares don't only respond to utility and to prices. So X cancels out from here. B doesn't depend on X. If preferences are homothetic, then how much you buy of each good doesn't depend on how well off you are. It doesn't depend on you. So U and X cancel out in that case. And then we get that budget shares depend on prices. And so in that case, real consumption is equal to welfare. Okay, so these chain weighted indices exactly answer the question that we're trying to answer. And the nice thing is that you don't need, if you want to use this for like ex post measurement, you don't need to assume anything about preferences, or you just like, if you can measure prices and quantities at every point in time between two time periods, you can construct the change in welfare without assuming anything about what the preferences are. So that's why this is a very useful result, and that's exactly what underlies all this, the construction of all these hybrid measures in the data. Okay. Now, when preferences are non-homothetic and or unstable in the sense that the budget shares depend on X, then this equivalence breaks. Okay. So, and in particular, it breaks because welfare uses treats substitution effects, that is changes in budget shares due to prices, differently than the changes in budget shares due to income effects and taste shocks. So let me kind of give you an example of that, or some intuition of that. Okay, and again, please, if there's any clarification or any question, feel free to ask. So so let me give you some intuition. So suppose we want to answer this, we want to measure this change in welfare between 1950 and 2014 for a given person, final preference in 2014, comparing again the prices and income this person had in 1950 versus the 2014. So we know that in the data, at least over long time periods, the share of certain goods has gone up. So in particular, healthcare, the share of spending in the budget on healthcare has gone up a lot over time. And this is partly like due to aging, the average person is older, and because richer societies can tend to spend more on health. Okay, so what's the gap between real consumption and welfare that can come out in this example? So chain indices, real consumption, it's going to basically use 1950 shares on healthcare to weight changes in prices of healthcare between 1950 and 1951. And it's going to use shares in 1951 to use to weight changes in prices between 1951 and 52, and so on and so forth. Welfare relevant, the welfare relevant index, EVM, is going to use 2014 demand to weight prices in 1950. In particular, I mean, these UT and XT are going to be at the level of 2014. Okay, so of course, welfare uses XT1 demand at 2014, the taste at 2014, because we're trying to answer a question using for a consumer with tastes in 2014, which are older, okay, those consumers, and we want to fix utility at T1 because we're exactly, I mean, EVM is defined in the way that in 1950 you're giving these guys the income so that they are as well off as in 2014. So only the demand of these guys in 2014 is relevant for welfare. How much these guys would have purchased of healthcare when they were young and poor is not relevant for welfare. I want to use the demand at the final preferences and the final income. Okay, so or that's kind of that's what explains the difference. The budget shares that we saw in 1950 and 51 or 52, 53, they're not relevant for these questions, for this welfare question. Okay? So of course, the budget shares have to be adjusted for the prices that are observed, but not for the taste shocks or for the income effects. That's what explains the difference. Okay, so so let me kind of, to make it a bit more concrete before the applications, let me kind of give you a parametric example, okay, to show how this works. So in particular, let's consider kind of very standard and non-homothetic CS preferences with taste shocks. Okay, so these are like preferences that are used a lot. Of course, CS they're used a lot with taste shocks too. Non-homothetic CS is very nice because kind of it maintains a lot of the properties of CS, but it allows for income effects in a very tractable way. So there's this work by Matsuyama, Komin, and Lashkari, and who else? Komin, Lashkari, and Mestieri. Yeah. So basically these preferences have like, so it's done like CS, where theta is the elasticity substitution between goods, it's constant. On top of that, there's going to be these taste shifters for different goods over time, X. And then we have this component here, which is like if these zetas vary across size, then as consumers get richer, they buy different shares of goods over time. If the zetas are all the same, then this boils down to homothetic CS. Okay, so how do previous formulas work for these preferences? And no, before that, one thing, which is there's an alternative way one could think of constructing welfare, which is to compute a price index, which is like you can express this expenditure function as some price index times the level of U. That's not a good, changes in P, in aggregate P defined in this way, that's not a good welfare measure because it depends on cardinal properties of preferences, of the utility function, sorry, that they cannot be pinned down with choice data. So we're not going to use kind of this a price index constructed in this way. So instead, we're going to use the formulas that I wrote before. So with this non-homothetic CS preference, the budget shares, they look very similar to homothetic CS, except that they're going to be adjusted by this U component. And then you can integrate the budget shares times the changes in prices, as in the formula before, keeping U and X fixed. And then we get a very simple formula for welfare changes between T0 and T1, which looks like exact algebra, basically. Like it's I mean, just taking ratios of prices in the time periods and constructing the homothetic aggregator with those changes in prices. Okay, so this is the formula for welfare. Kind of a few things here. It only depends on the elasticity substitution, given the budget shares at T1, and you don't need to know condition on the once you have knowledge of the final budget shares to compute welfare. You don't need to know the tail shocks. You don't need to know the X's, and you don't need to know the income elasticities, which are sometimes hard to estimate. Okay, so in fact, the formula looks exactly the same as the one you would get with an homothetic and stable CS preferences, fixing the final budget shares and going backwards in time. So it's exactly the same. So it's a very simple way to measure changes in welfare, especially for ex post questions where you observe the final budget shares. And in our applications, we're going to use this formula. Okay. Yeah, so now let me kind of, before going to the macro problem, let me give you some intuition of why, like what explains the gap between real GDP or real consumption and welfare. Okay, so for that, we're going to use a second order approximation. So just
Ariel, can I ask you something small about the previous slide?
Go ahead, yeah.
So I think I'm thinking more like a practical consideration on this. So how do you deal with so going back to your example of 1950 versus 2014? How do you deal with like change? I mean, with like zeros, right? Like think of it if you're going like to a very like disaggregated level of products, for example, products that you have in T1 probably don't exist back in 1950. So say an iPhone, right?
Yeah.
You're not talking about the communications. You're talking about iPhone versus
Yeah. No, that's a very good question.
And I'm assuming that some of these applications, I mean, are going to be more interesting for like long run questions, because in short run, probably stability is kind of okay. Maybe homotheticity not, but for short run questions, maybe it's not a big concern. But like for long run questions, these changes in the consideration sets of products that are available may be an issue. So I'm wondering how can you deal with that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's one of the extensions we have, how to deal with a new goods problem, and we actually extend this formula to exactly deal with that, and to give you like a preview of that. So if you think about like the standard way to think about new goods, like think of Finstrom 94 or Redding Weinstein, for example, is that people didn't consume a good because it was not available. Like the price was infinity, and that's kind of the standard way of dealing with new goods. But at least for some goods, it could be that I didn't consume it because I didn't care about it, I didn't value it, and the reason that I started buying a good is because now I saw an ad on TV and I started liking it, and the welfare implications of those two cases are going to be very different. So in one of the extensions, if I have time, I'm going to talk about it. We show how to deal with the two. We have both new goods coming from infinite prices that become finite, or suddenly your taste your taste change and you start valuing a good. For our applications, So in the we're gonna construct that kind of continuing goods only. So we haven't yet done like an empirical application where we take into account new goods, but the formulas, we have formulas to show how to do it. So yeah, so that's important to clarify.
Thanks.
Yeah, so now kind of let me explain you what kind of let me characterize the gap between real consumption and the change in welfare to give you some intuition. Okay, so I'm going to use a second order approximation for that. So this is again I'm just repeating the definition of the change in real consumption, the chain weighted real consumption, which is this. And I'm going to consider a Taylor approximation around T0, and I'm going to increase slightly T1. So it's like think of it as a small time period. So what's the change in real consumption? So the first order term is the change in nominal income deflated by a fixed share inflation index. Okay, so where this is like in the initial period, so this is like a Las Perez index. So this is like the standard Las Perez inflation index. So that's the change in real consumption to first order. Okay, now there's also like nonlinear terms coming from substitution effects as prices change, people change their budget shares, and so then we have this term 1/2. It's a 1/2 because it's a second order approximation, and then we have the covariance between the change in budget shares and the changes in prices. So this is like substitution effects. So if spending rises for goods that become more expensive, so this covariance is positive, then real consumption is going to fall compared to the first order term. So if we shift our expenditures to goods that become more expensive, then real consumption, the change in real consumption is lower than the one you would get if you use a Las Perez inflation index. And that's exactly substitution effects. So that's real consumption. So now I'm going to compare this with welfare. So now I'm going to do the same thing for EV. So the first order term is the same. So to a first order, welfare and real consumption are the same. There's no bias here. Okay, so that's kind of, it's good to know. And now, for the differences are going to rise in the second order terms. So the substitution effects coming from changes in prices are exactly the same in the two. Again, because both welfare and real consumption treat substitution due to change in prices in the same way. Remember that the B's depend on the P's of each period. So the substitution effect is going to be the same. So in particular, if theta is less than 1, I'm doing this for the non-homothetic CS case. If theta is less than 1, then as prices go up, then you increase the expenditure. So that's going to lower both real consumption and welfare. So these terms are identical. Okay, the difference is going to come from the changes in expenditure switching coming from income effects and taste shocks. So consider this term. This is changes in budget shares due to changes in real income. This is the change in real income. And then this term is going to depend on the covariance between income effects and income elasticities and changes in prices. So if the goods that become more expensive are have a higher income elasticity, like healthcare, that these are income elastic goods and the price went up, relative price, then you're going to substitute into these goods, and that's going to lower the real consumption. Okay, so that's kind of one of the terms that generates expenditure switching. The key is that there's a 1/2 here. For welfare, we have the same term, but it's multiplied by 1. Why is that? Because, again, you want to use the preferences and the income of this guy in the final period. So you want to put much more weight on the expenditure switching coming from income effects compared to real GDP. of real consumption. So that's where the difference comes from. And a similar term, it happens. I mean, there's a similar term for taste shocks. So real consumption is going to, of course, this is expenditure switching coming from taste shocks. Again, if you start to like a good that becomes more expensive over time, that's going to lower real consumption. That's a negative term here with a 1/2 because you're using like the budget shares in every point in time. But welfare, you want to use the final preferences right away. So this term is going to be double compared to this one. There's a 1 instead of a 1/2. Okay, so that's again, it's the difference is that you don't want to use budget shares as you move along between T0 and T1. You want to use the budget, you want to put much more weight on the final budget shares. And that's why there's this term -1. And basically, and the other point that comes from here is that if changes in prices and income elasticities have a covariance of 0, or if the taste shocks and the change in prices have a covariance of 0, then there's no, these two terms are 0, both here and here, so there's no gap. So the gap between measured objects and welfare relevant objects is only going to be relevant when there's a systematic correlation between the price changes and either the taste shocks or the income elasticities. Okay, so this is kind of
the 20 minutes to go.
How much?
20.
20. Okay, so I'll speed up a bit. So I want to get to the applications. So the macro problem. So this is going to be I'm going to go through this. I'm going to go a bit faster, and then I'm going to move fast to the applications. So now I want to ask a different question, which is how do we're going to think about that prices are endogenous, and prices might respond to taste shocks or to income effects. Okay, so how should we think about welfare when prices are endogenous? So for that, we're gonna write like a very kind of simple, like neoclassical economy. We have extensions with distortions in the appendix of the paper. So let me start with this like very kind of standard framework with perfectly competitive neoclassical economy, closed economy, representative agent. As an extension, we have heterogeneous agents. So we're going to have F primary factors like labor, capital, land, etc. At a given fixed supply. So we don't have endogenous labor supply here, but which we could include. And there's N goods, and we're going to have like these standard production functions, which combine intermediate inputs. So a producer of good I is going to use intermediate inputs from every other producer J, and this is the factors that this producer uses, and then there's some Higgs neutral TFP AI, and we're going to assume that G is consonant to scale without loss of generality because we can always add factors to it. So that's kind of the assumptions on production, and there's some fixed supply of each factor, of each primary factor. So let me define VA of LX as like how much utility the representative agent can get given the technologies A's, all the productivities, and the endowments L, given some preferences that this guy has X. So this is just like the max utility that is in the production possibility frontier that is feasible. And the thought experiment is going to be consider 2 time periods, T0, T1, or again, this could apply to space as well, but I'm going to focus on time, T0 and T1, where the technologies change, the factor endowments change, and maybe preferences change too between T0 and T1. Okay? So these shocks are going to imply some equilibrium prices, PT0 and IT0, and the prices go to PT1 and IT1. If you solve them all, you're going to get some prices and income. Okay? So, of course, one could answer the micro question, the little m question, asking the question like, how does a consumer feel about this budget constraint versus the other? Okay. Now, what I want to argue is that this micro welfare is a poor measure to answer like the impact of changing technology. when you have these non-homotheticities or taste shocks. Okay, so suppose again that households age from T0 to T1. So X changes. So consumers like certain goods more than others at T1 versus T0. But suppose that all the technologies and endowments are fixed. So the PPF isn't changed in this economy. Okay, so with regression to scale, this is just an example. If demand for healthcare goes up, then the price of healthcare will go up too. So prices respond to changes in demand. So if we ask the micro welfare, if we put a guy in this economy facing these prices, and we compute the micro welfare as I defined it in a few minutes ago, then I'm going to get that this guy is going to be worse off at T1 than at T0. Why? Because this guy likes healthcare more at T1 and T0, and the price of healthcare went up. So this guy would prefer to live in T0 than in T1. Okay. Now, by construction, the technology hasn't changed. So the society of old people, a society of old people is indifferent between the PPF at T0 and T1 because they're the same. Okay. So, so micro welfare is not, I mean, it's not going to really measure the welfare change due to changes in technologies. So when in the case where prices are endogenous to changes in taste, for example, like in this case, micro welfare is going to give us a misleading measure of welfare for this question, to value changes in technologies. So given this problem with the micro welfare measure, we're going to propose a macro welfare measure that exactly takes into account that prices respond to demand, that prices are endogenous. Okay? And it's going to be very similar to the micro definition, but it's going to exactly internalize or take into account that prices are endogenous. So the definition of this welfare measure is going to be how much do factor endowments have to increase at T0 for the representative consumer to be as well off as she would be under the new PPF at T1. Okay, so kind of the difference is that, again, there's no prices here. Prices are endogenous, so we're not expressing this welfare in terms of income, which depend on prices, which are endogenous, but we're expressing it in terms of an endowment. How much do all endowments, factor endowments, have to change so that the economy is indifferent between the two production posterior frontiers? Okay. It turns out, we show in the paper, that if preferences are stable and homothetic, or if the PPF is linear, so prices don't respond to demand, then macro welfare is the same as micro welfare. These are two different questions, but the answer is the same. Okay? Now, when preferences are unstable or non-homothetic, and the PPF is nonlinear, then macro welfare is not the same as micro welfare. They answer different questions. Okay. It turns out that, okay, this is a graphical representation of the two measures. So this is a micro welfare. This is a two-good economy. So this is like the initial point. This is the budget constraint, the initial budget constraint. This is the final indifference curve at T1. The micro welfare is like how much I have to shift the budget constraint proportionally, so that this guy is indifferent, is at the indifference point at T1. And the macro welfare instead is going to shift the PPF proportionally. Okay? And we can show that if preferences are non-homothetic or unstable, then EVM capital M macro is different to little m EV. Okay? And we can characterize the difference and the macro difference. And very quickly, very similar intuition holds to understand the difference between measured objects and welfare. You can write it in a very similar way to the micro welfare that I showed before. Okay, so let me kind of just one definition, which is these lambdas are now like the sales share of good I in the economy, given technologies and given utility and given tastes. So these are sales shares, and sometimes called Domar weights. And They're shares, but they could add up to a number bigger than 1 if there's intermediate inputs. Okay, so there's a Halten theorem version in this economy here, where basically you can write the change in real GDP as a weighted average of changes in productivities, weighted by the sales share at every point in time. This is exactly Halten's theorem extended in an economy with non-homothetic and Tay-Shocks preferences. And then welfare, this macro welfare that I defined before, is exactly the same, but where the sales shares are constructed in an economy where you're fixing the demands at the final period level. So it's like you're fixing preference at T1, and you're basically fixing the income effects at the final at their final level. Okay, so it's the difference between these two objects is that one uses the actual sales shares, and the other one uses these counterfactual sales shares in this counterfactual economy with a consumer that has final preferences and income effects from the final period. But otherwise, these two things are the same. So it's one can compare the two in the same way that I did before. So let me get to the applications. I'm going to skip all this. And we have like simple characterizations of the gap between the two, where now like the gap between welfare and real GDP depends on the covariance between demand shocks and productivities, and the covariance between income elasticities and changes in productivity. So before we had all these covariances with prices, but now these covariances are in terms of primitives, productivities and demand shocks, or productivities and income elasticities. But I'm not gonna. I don't want to. I want to jump to the applications. Yeah. So how much time I have?
Let's give it 13, 14 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna talk about 3 applications to see like how these results are relevant. So the first application is to think about a long-run growth. So I want to compare like measured long-run growth with kind of more like a welfare relevant growth. Okay, and I'm going to relate this to Baumann's causes. So what's Baumann's causes? So this is the observation that it kind of holds in many different settings, in many countries, that as economies grow, as they become richer, then the sectors that expand are the low productivity growth sectors, like services or healthcare, for example. Okay, so basically there's this observation that the fact that as economies grow, they tend to consume more of these low productivity growth sectors is that drags down the productivity growth in these economies. Okay, so now we can use the results that I had before, and basically to argue that if structural transformation, if this shifts in consumption in sectors is caused by pure substitution effects, okay, and no income effects and no change in taste. It's just the fact that as the price of services grows, then we want to consume more services because the elasticity is less than 1. Then the way we measure TFP in the data is fine. That's kind of the welfare relevant object. We want to use like the observed shares of each sector at every point in time. Okay, so then we want to use the sales shares in the data that we observe to construct TFP. Now, if this structural transformation was driven by the fact that richer societies want to spend more on healthcare or services, or the fact that as economies grow, that the people are aging and they want to consume more healthcare, then we don't want to use the observed sales shares. We want to use terminal sales shares, right? If all the income, if all the structural transformation is coming from these two, there's no substitution effects. So that's kind of can generate a gap between the measured object in the data of TFP and the welfare element. So here's kind of US data. So we constructed aggregate TFP using data from about 65 sectors. So these are aggregated. So this important issue that Federico was raising that people didn't consume iPhones in 1950, that's not here because we're working with high-weight sectors. Okay, so there's a question like how to redo this when you have when you go more disaggregated. Okay, so this is not going to be taken into account here. So this is what is this line? So every line here compares how much. So it's let's say this is starting in 1948. So this is 1948 versus 2014 is how much is TFP grow between 1948 and 2014 now for different measures. Okay, so the blue line is if you use initial shares. So I'm going to weight each sector, the TFP of each sector, according to the shares of each sector in sales in 1948. Okay, so that's a blue line. So TFP grew about 60 log points. Okay, and of course, as we get closer to 2014, then the number is smaller because I mean this is always compare each period to 2014. So that's a blue line. The orange line is measuring TFP but using the actual sales shares in every period, not the initial shares, but the actual ones. So this is what measure TFP is in the data. This is exactly what you will get if you construct it in the chain weighted way. And you can see that there's like a 10% difference between the blue and the red line, and that's exactly Bowman's causes. Okay, and the way that it's typically measured, because as we move over time, more and more sales share are coming from these sectors that had low TFP growth. So that's the difference between using initial shares and the actual shares in every point in time. That's the gap between the red and the blue line. Okay. Now, so the question now is, what is welfare? What is a welfare relevant object? A welfare relevant TFP. So if this shift in spending shares was only caused by substitution effects, by changes in prices, then the orange line is exactly welfare. But if this reallocation between goods and services was driven only by income effects or taste shocks, any combination of the two, then welfare is going to use terminal sales shares. So it's going to put a much bigger weight on services because services have a much higher share in 2014. So then we get the yellow line, which is lower than the red line. Okay, so these are two extremes, only substitution effects or only income effects and taste shocks. You can see that the gap is big. The gap between the red and the blue and the blue line is almost as big as the gap between the orange and the yellow line. Okay, so what this says is that if this structural transformation was driven by income effects or taste shocks, or taste changes, then this Bowman causes is twice as important as we really thought. We're really mismeasuring TFP growth by about 20%. Okay, log points. Yeah. So the main thing is also settling whether this structural transformation is arising due to income effects or taste changes versus substitution effects has important welfare implications. It's a difference in the red and the yellow line. Okay, so that's application number one. And we have we also do cases beyond these two polar extremes. So now the second is more for business cycle, for more short-term fluctuations. So if I go back to this figure, you can see that if I look at 1 year changes or 2 year changes or 3 year changes, this is not a big deal. These lines are almost the same. So, and we know that except for COVID, for example, unless you look at the COVID period, these sales shares across sectors doesn't vary much over the business cycle. It varies a lot over long periods, but not much over short periods. But one reason this is the case is because we're using very aggregate data here. If you go to more disaggregated data, like firm level data or product level data, then we know that the sales shares are much more volatile. If you go to any scanner level data or any firm level data, the volatility of sales shares is really large. The more disaggregated you go, the more volatile these shares are. Okay, So this increases the scope for this bias. Okay. So so what we did to illustrate this point is we took the Nielsen data for the U.S. or that one can access through the University of Chicago, and we constructed price indices between 2004 and 2019 using like the product level data. And basically, and if you look at the product level data, it's very hard to explain like all the variation in sales shares only using changes in prices. So you need some shifters in the demand to explain the large movements in sales shares. So we compute the change in the continuing goods price index. Again, we don't take into account the new goods in this data. And we compare it with the kind of a standard measure of inflation, which uses the actual sales shares in the data period by period. So here's what we get. So basically the red line and the blue line, which is overlapping here, is the inflation you would get between 2004 or each year versus 2019. So this number is higher as you go back in time. Again, using kind of standard inflation measures where you update the shares every year. And inflation was a bit higher than 20%. The yellow line is now if we use our formulas allowing for taste shocks. So then you want to use 2019 demands and feeding in changes in prices. Okay, so you don't want to take into account the changes in shares that are coming from changes in taste. And the inflation that is about a 4% higher. So the true the measured inflation is like understating the welfare inflation by about 4%. And at 1 year horizon, this is about 1%. This is the gap in these two lines. So why is welfare relevant inflation higher than chained? It's because in the data to explain the shifts in expenditure shares and prices, you need a positive correlation between prices and demand shocks. Okay, so there's a positive co-movement between taste shocks and prices if we want to explain the co-movements in the data. Basically, prices and shares have very low correlation, they're close to zero. If you don't have taste shocks, then the correlation will be negative with a negative slope demand curve, and elasticity being on 1. So to explain the low co-movement, you need a positive correlation between demand shocks and prices. And then I argued before that if prices and taste shocks are positively correlated, that's going to lower welfare. It's going to generate a higher inflation. So the point here is that at short-term frequencies, if you go to more disaggregated data, these biases, these gaps become more relevant. And it's straightforward to implement this using disaggregated data. And to finish up, the last application is the COVID business cycle. And I think that's kind of a clear example where it will be hard to explain the shifts between sectorial shares just using the observed changes in prices. We think that COVID-19 is a clear example of a mixture of supply and demand shifters. So we are trying to recompute measures of GDP and inflation that are welfare relevant, in the sense that you don't want to use the changes in take into account the changes in budget shares that are driven by these demand shocks. So what do? We take like the version of the model of a paper by David and Emmanuel in the AR, and basically in that model to explain the changes in employment, we focus on the first few months in the recession. So the downward part, the drop. Okay, so we calibrate the changes in labor sector by sector and changes in demand or taste for each sector. There's 66 sectors to explain changes in expenditures and changes in employment by sector. So that's how we match the data between the first quarter and the second quarter. So it's like really the peak of the recession. Okay, and again, to explain these patterns, you need a combination of both supply and demand shocks. So what do we do with this? So the first thing is we illustrate what micro welfare and what macro welfare are and how they compare with measured OPEX like chain real consumption. Okay, and we do it for every column is a different set of elasticities. So let's focus on the middle row, on the middle column, and we can see that micro welfare losses are much larger than macro welfare at final preferences, and measured objects, measured real consumption is somewhere in between. And the reason that micro welfare falls by more than macro welfare is because prices rise for goods with increasing demand, but the macro welfare doesn't take that into account because it understands that prices in partly are rising due to demand shocks. And so that's kind of one point, which is there's a big gap between micro and macro welfare, and both of them are very different to the measured objects. And the final thing we do is to say, what about real GDP as a measure of production? Let's forget welfare. Welfare is very hard to measure. Let's say we want to have a measure that at least reflects what is being produced in the economy. Okay, and that's kind of think about real GDP as a measure of production. Let's forget about welfare. Okay, the point we make here, this is the final point, is that real GDP doesn't measure anything in this economy, in the sense that it's a path-dependent object. How you feed in the shocks, how you feed in the path of demand and supply shocks is going to matter for what you get for the change in real GDP between the initial and the final period. So we take the calibrated economy between 2 quarters. The initial and the final are what they are in the data. And then we say, suppose that the supply shocks come before and then the demand shocks come later, and we get a number. Real GDP falls by a certain number. And then we say, now suppose that the demand shocks come before and then the supply shocks. These are like completely arbitrary assumptions. The initial and the final allocations of prices are exactly the same. So T0 and T1 are the same. The only thing that is different is the timing of the shocks in the middle. The change in real GDP that compares T0 versus T1 is very different in these two cases. Real GDP falls by more if supply shocks hit first, because supply and demand shocks are positively correlated. So what does that imply? Suppose that we have a recession, then we go up, we go back, and we are exactly back in the same initial allocation, so nothing changes. The production is the same, but the timing of the shocks is different in the recession, in the down part than in the upper part. Then the change in real GDP between the initial and the final period can be completely different. They can be different by 6% in our examples. Everything is unchanged in T0 and T1, but the change in real GDP can be very different. So what this tells us is like any comparison of how fast did Chile recover against Argentina, or like all these rankings of how countries did in terms of the recovery from COVID, they depend, in a world where there's like demand shocks, as we think it was the case in COVID, this comparison depends on completely irrelevant details like the path that these economies took in the middle in these 2 time periods. So we have to be very careful in interpreting differences in GDPs across countries when you have these important demand shocks that are driving these changes in sales shares across sectors. So I'm going to finish here. We have some extensions, heterogeneous agents. I'm happy to talk about it after. We extend our formulas to expensive margin adjustments like new goods. We haven't implemented that, but we show how this compares to Feenstra. And the welfare implications are very different. And then we have dynamic examples in an economy with investment, and like a standard neoclassical economy with investment. And we also consider distorted economies. So I'm going to finish here. So what this paper does is we provide a toolbox for welfare computation in the presence of Tail-shocks and non-homotheticities. And we show how to modify kind of the standard divisia or chain indices in partial equilibrium, or Halten theorem in general equilibrium, when there's Tail-shocks and non-homotheticities. The key kind of problem with chaining, the way it's done in the data, is that it doesn't correctly account for expenditure switching caused by Tail-shocks or income effects. Welfare treats expenditure switching caused by Tail-shocks or income effects very different than the standard measures. So we need to take that into account. And in these cases, that there's two different questions one could ask: micro welfare. That in this case, when there's income effects or Tail-shocks, they give different answers, and both are different to chained objects. And we show why this matters in our applications. And I'll stop here. Sorry that I went over time.
Thanks, Ariel. This was great. We have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions, so just fire away. Go ahead, Pablo, if you have any question.
Yes. It's more a suggestion than a question, but there's a long-standing fact that maybe your approach might have clarified.
I cannot hear you very well. Sorry, it's going on and off.
So no, my point is that there is a very well-known stylized fact that has been explained in a particular way, but that in your framework might shed some extra light. And this is the Balassa-Samuelson effect.
Hmm?
The idea that as economies develop, the real exchange rate appreciates. And the typical answer has been in your words, a substitution technological issue because of the productivity of tradables versus tradables. But there's also the question of whether this is due to non-homothetic preferences. And you see, empirically, people have tried a number of approaches, but it has never been really clarified. Given that this is a very important issue in open economy macroeconomics, I think your approach is right there and could help explain how much of this is due to substitution and how much is due to changes in expenditure shares due to non-homothetic preferences.
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. That's a great comment. So, I mean, there's a big literature in growth, like all the structural transformation, Rogerson, Weda, Kowalski. I mean, there's like much older work on this, and they try to. I mean, a lot of this work, if you look at the handbook chapter of Rogerson, I mean, it's a lot about how to tease out the contribution of like purely complementarity. So, I mean, lack of substitution, like the fact that different sectors grew differently, and if you have like low substitution, that's going to generate that there's an increase in the sectors, an increase in the share in the shares of the sectors that grew less. But then and then there's like follow-up work saying, oh well, but if you have non-homothetic preferences, then that can explain part of it. And there's some papers by Timo Boppard and Mestieri and Comín, and that they say let's estimate income effects using like household level data, using changes in prices, and let's estimate income elasticity from there. And so they're exactly trying to figure out the contribution of one versus the other in a very in a positive way, like saying like simply how much is explained from one versus the other. And that work uses the data that you were mentioning, like the changes in relative prices, because to estimate demand analysis, you need to take into account the changes in prices. And I agree that those facts on structural transformation are very related to Wallace Samuelson. Totally agree. I think it's the same. I mean, it's very similar. I don't think that has been totally settled. Like if you look at like this paper by Komin, Lashkari, Mestieri, they say like 80% is accounted for by income effects. If you look at Bopart, it's like, or Kawowski Buera is less than 50%. It's not totally settled. I think it's a very open discussion. I know there's a conference, state conference going on, I think today and tomorrow, where a lot of papers are about this. Our only contribution to that the debate is these two stories, if it's income effects or substitution effects, they have very different welfare implications. So it's not just we want to settle this debate from a positive perspective, like what is that explains the facts. It has profound implications on like how much growth was there in a welfare relevant way. Yeah.
Any more questions or comments? So the one question I had, Ariel, is you were saying about this, keeping X sort of fixed at time at T1, but I guess the other sort of question is, you can think that maybe let's go back to your example of the CES, that the shifts, like say from 1950 to 2014, changes not only the taste shock, but also changes the elasticities of substitution, or changes other characteristics that change the shape of the preference. And even in the case in which you can think that the preference can change endogenously to the changes in those shifts. Kind of thinking of how things might have happened between the last 60, 70 years, and sort of to what extent thinking about endogenous preferences to those type of shifts, like say shifts towards services and so on, are important to take into account. If you want to think about those sort of long run questions on the stability of preferences and how shifts in the preferences, shift the relevant measure that we should use for welfare.
Right. Okay. No, that's a good comment also. So I guess the key distinction is like, I think that to measure any welfare measure that is meaningful, I think that in the sense that it doesn't depend on how you cardinalize the utility function, which is something that there's infinite ways of doing that. We know that. And you don't want to, any welfare measure has to like keep the preferences fixed. Now, it could be, of course, that the elasticity substitution changes as we move around, like the within a given indifference curve. I mean, CS is very special that the elasticities are fixed, right? But along the indifference curve. But if you go to any other preferences, that's not going to be the case. So you're going to have like endogenous changes in elasticity substitution as you change the allocations. So those you want to take that into account. CS is very special in that regard. Now, suppose that as you become richer, you become more inelastic, because you're like, well, there's a lot of evidence on that poor people are more elastic and rich people are inelastic. Okay, so those changes you don't want to take into account in a welfare measure, because that's coming from changes that's coming from a change in income effects. And by definition, the way we're defining measure welfare is like we're giving you income in the initial period to keep you at your final indifference curve. So those are changes in substitution elasticities that you don't want to take into account if they're caused by changing the utility function, by changing the in the indifference curve. Okay. Now there's also like all the production parameters. Now that's if suppose that you think that capital and labor are becoming more and more substitutable, let's say, because of robots or whatever. I mean, that's the production side of the economy. That's very different. That you want to take that into account, because output of goods is something you can measure. So if there's changes in the production function, including changing the shape of the production function, those have to be taken into account when you construct welfare. What you don't want to take into account is the changes in the substitution elasticities that are coming from changes as you become richer or poorer. But that's like by construction, because again, it's like, think about the way I'm defining welfare. I'm giving you income in the initial period to keep you in the final indifference curve. So what you would demand if you were poorer, the shape of the demand curve when you're poor, that doesn't matter in the calculation. I don't know if that answered your question. If you think of other, what do you mean by endogenous preferences? Like, there's endogenous changes in the substitution elasticities with non-CS as you move along. Take AIDS or take translog, the elasticities are not constant, and those have to be taken into account. But these are like compensated elasticities within the same indifference curve. Those you want to take into account.
Yeah, no, I guess CS was a bad example. If you can have a more flexible utility function that sort of takes into account the shift that I was worried about.
Right. So
that's correct.
I have a paper now, a new paper with John Vogel and other co-authors, where we consider CS, but non-homothetic CS, but we also allow for the elasticity substitution to vary across indifference curves. Again, because poor people are more elastic than. And we show how to estimate those differences. But when you construct welfare, you want to fix the elasticity at the final level. You don't want to take into account that as people become richer or poorer, the elasticity changes. That is not going to be incorporated in our welfare measure.